So we move ahead with appropriation. I told you appropriation has to be unconditional, and these are some other points you have to remember along with appropriation. Appropriation means selection of goods. Appropriation may be by sample, may be by description. You can do it anyway. Appropriation is complete only when the goods are in deliverable state. If the goods are not in deliverable state, you cannot say that the appropriation is complete. In appropriation, it may be by the consent of buyer done by the seller, and the consent may be express or implied. And finally, the seller delivers the goods without reserving the right to disposal. That is unconditional. Without reserving the right to disposal means that the seller gives the goods to the carrier, to the transporter, saying that the goods belong to the seller unless some condition is satisfied. That is, the payment is received, or the buyer does something, or the buyer gives some other goods in return. So all these conditions cannot be put by the seller. The appropriation has to be unconditional. If it is conditional, we say that the right to disposal of the goods has been reserved by the seller. That means if the buyer does not perform some condition that he had accepted, or this condition what the seller had put on buyer, if that is not fulfilled, the transporter will not give the goods to the buyer. That means the seller has the right to disposal over the goods, because it should be such that once the goods have left the seller, they are buyer's goods. It was seller's responsibility to deliver the goods, and once he gives the goods to the transporter, to the carrier, they are assumed to be of the buyer, because it is presumed that the carrier is buyer's agent. It is presumed that the carrier or the transporter is buyer's agent. And since the transporter is buyer's agent, as soon as the goods go to the transporter, it is assumed that the goods have been delivered to the buyer. But if the seller tells the transporter that do not give the goods to the buyer unless and until some condition is satisfied, that means he is reserving the right to disposal of goods. And if he is doing that, then we cannot say that the appropriation has been made, because appropriation has to be unconditional. Okay, so we move ahead. So what is conditional appropriation? Conditional appropriation is where the seller reserves the right to dispose the goods. Now this right may be expressed or may be implied. It may be in the contract of sale made by the seller and the buyer, or it may be implied from the actions, the behavior, the conduct of the parties. The next point is, we've already discussed, it may be expressed. The seller reserves the right to disposal and the ownership still lies with the seller. I told you the ownership has not transferred. Since the seller has reserved the right to disposal over the goods, the ownership has not transferred. he can still decide what to do about the goods, how to dispose the goods. He can tell the carrier to not to deliver the goods. He can tell the carrier to come back. He can tell the carrier to hold the goods on his behalf. That means the carrier, the transporter, is not the agent of the buyer. He acts as the agent of the seller. And when he acts as the agent of the seller, that means the goods have not been given to the agent of the buyer. The goods have not been given to the buyer. The ownership has not transferred. The seller still controls the ownership. Now, what is implied reservation of right of disposal? This was expressed if it is expressed in the contract. Implied means he intimates the transporter to not to deliver the goods. He does not tell buyer anything, but he tells the transporter. It is R here. It is not D, it is R. So seller reserves the right to disposal, and you see that the seller has the ownership. It is not mentioned in the contract, yet the seller tells the transporter to not to give the goods to the buyer until and unless he gives the order. Now, many a times we see that the sale happens through bill of exchange or maybe through checks, some negotiable instrument. Now, these bills or checks may have some time lag between the payment is cleared. Okay. I sell goods to you and you accept a bill of exchange, against it. Now, do you become the owner of those goods? No, you do not become the owner of the goods, because until and unless you have paid the price to me, you do not become the owner. So whenever the sale happens through bill of exchange or a check, which has not been cleared as yet, it has been implied in law that the seller has reserved the right of disposal to goods. The buyer does not become the owner of the goods. He'll become the owner of the goods when he pays the seller. And let's say the bill of exchange had a tenure of 30 days. So after 30 days, when the buyer makes the payment, he'll become the owner. Till that time, the seller remains the owner. Okay? So it is always implied by the law that whenever the sale has happened through bill of exchange, the seller reserves the right to disposal. The ownership remains with the seller and not the buyer till the bill is paid. This is very important. Until the bill is paid.